A gang leader pressed a gun to a veteran's head. Seconds later, the room erupted in gunfire, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He thought humiliating the old soldier with the butt of his gun would end the fight, blood already dripping as the crowd laughed. Subscribe if you believe no warrior's honor should ever be mocked. The silence of the street shattered with the hollow clang of a loose metal shutter swaying in the night wind. Ezekiel Grant stopped mid-step, his sharp eyes narrowing as he stared at the trembling sheet of steel that marked the entrance to his auto repair shop. The shop had been his refuge since leaving the battlefield behind, a place where machines, not men, broke down and could be mended with patience. But tonight, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint reek of spray paint lingered in the cold night breeze. Daniel, his son, stood a few paces ahead, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned pale under the dim glow of the flickering streetlight. "Look," Daniel whispered harshly, pointing at the wall. Ezekiel followed his gaze and saw it, a fresh splash of crimson paint, the symbol of the Iron Vultures scrawled across the brick in jagged lines. The emblem resembled the talons of a bird, slashing downward as if to mark territory. The gang's presence was undeniable. The old soldier's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what such markings meant. This was no idle act of vandalism. It was a message. "Don't," Ezekiel said firmly, catching the flicker of rage in his son's eyes as Daniel stepped forward, as though ready to scrape the paint off with his bare hands. His voice was low but carried the weight of command, the same tone he once used in deserts and jungles far from home. "This is bait. They want you to rise to it." Daniel turned, jaw set, his youthful fire pushing back against the steady calm of his father. "We can't just ignore this. They think we're weak. They think they can own these streets. Our streets." His voice cracked slightly, more from passion than fear. Ezekiel studied him, the way his shoulders squared, the way his eyes glimmered with defiance. He remembered being that age, fueled by certainty, by the need to prove himself in a world that mocked hesitation. He placed a heavy hand on Daniel's shoulder, steadying him, anchoring him like a rock against the tide. "We will not bow to fear," Ezekiel replied, his words deliberate, meant not just for Daniel, but for himself. The pain in his leg flared as he shifted his weight, an old battlefield injury that never let him forget what recklessness could cost. He refused to show it, but the limp had always been there, a reminder that strength was not about fury, but endurance. The street around them seemed to shrink as shadows lengthened along the walls. The graffiti glared back like a challenge, daring them to act. Somewhere in the distance, the faint thump of bass echoed from a car stereo, followed by laughter, male voices, rough and mocking, carried faintly through the night. Daniel's eyes darted toward the sound, but Ezekiel shook his head. "Keep moving," he murmured. They walked slowly toward the shop entrance. The glass pane in the door bore a spiderweb crack that hadn't been there the morning before. Daniel's lips pressed thin as he brushed his hand across it, the broken shards crunching faintly under his touch. His father's gaze swept the area, trained instincts mapping out the possibilities, where an enemy might wait, where an ambush could spring. The stillness of the neighborhood was deceptive, a calm stretched too tightly, like silence before gunfire. As they neared the shop, Ezekiel paused and scanned the street once more. A single alleyway mouth yawned open across from them, darker than the rest. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure shift within it, but when he blinked, there was nothing, just blackness layered with the stink of garbage. He kept his eyes on it longer than he wanted to, sensing something watching back. Daniel, impatient, pulled a key from his pocket. "We should check inside, make sure they didn't take anything." His voice carried more volume than Ezekiel liked. The old soldier motioned for quiet, but his son's urgency betrayed his youth. The door resisted when Daniel tried to push it open, as though something heavy leaned against it from inside. He shoved harder, the hinges groaning until the door gave way with a snap. The scent of oil and metal greeted them, but beneath it lay something sharper. Spray paint, again, and cigarette smoke. The workbenches looked untouched, yet the presence of others hung in the air like residue. "They've been here," Ezekiel muttered under his breath. Daniel stepped inside, shoulders taut, eyes scanning. The overhead lights sputtered when he flicked the switch, dim cones of yellow spilling across the floor. The half-fixed vehicles, tools scattered across benches, and grease-stained rags lay just as they had left them, but the sense of violation gnawed at both father and son. Their sanctuary had been trespassed upon. Ezekiel rested a hand on the counter, his knuckles whitening as his mind replayed the signs. The graffiti, the cracked glass, the smoke. Each was a breadcrumb, a trail leading to confrontation. His years of battle told him this was no random mischief. It was calculated. It was the opening move in a larger game. Daniel slammed a wrench back onto the table, the clatter ringing out too loudly in the small shop. "We can't let them do this," he hissed. His face flushed with anger, the lines of youth hardened by injustice. Ezekiel turned toward him, voice steady as stone. "We fight when the time demands it. Not before. Rage will get you killed. Discipline keeps you alive." He caught Daniel's eyes, forcing him to meet the weight of his words. Outside, a bottle clinked against the pavement, rolling slowly until it tapped against the curb. Both men stiffened, their instincts sharpening. Ezekiel reached for the nearest heavy object, a rusted wrench, while Daniel instinctively shifted his hand toward the concealed revolver in his jacket. Neither spoke, but the tension in the room rose, stretching like wire pulled taut. The silence returned, but it was different now. No longer empty, it was filled with menace, with the knowledge that they were not alone. Somewhere beyond those walls, shadows moved, waiting for the moment to step into the light. Ezekiel took a deep breath, steadying the storm within him. His body ached, but his spirit held fast. He turned to his son, voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "Remember this, Daniel. Fear is what they want. If we let it control us, they've already won." The boy nodded slowly, but his hands still trembled, fire flickering just beneath the surface. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of boots scuffing against concrete. The stage was set, the players closing in. Ezekiel knew that tonight would test more than their strength. It would test their bond, their will, and their very place in a city that had forgotten peace. That night, their decision to stand tall would set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. The silence of the streets was only the calm before a storm. Rafe Calder struck before a single word could be uttered. The steel barrel of his pistol cracked hard against Ezekiel Grant's temple with a sickening thud, the sound echoing through the empty street like the toll of a war drum. Blood welled instantly from the wound, running down the veteran's cheek in a slow, crimson trail. Ezekiel staggered back, one knee buckling, but he refused to fall. He planted his foot, spine stiffened by decades of discipline, and raised his head to meet the eyes of the man who had attacked him. Rafe's sneer deepened, pleased by the reaction, or lack thereof. "Still standing?" he said with mock admiration, his voice deep and rough like gravel scraped across concrete. "Guess old soldiers really don't die. They just keep guarding junkyards." Daniel stood frozen just behind his father, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The impact, the blood, the blatant disrespect, it all blurred into a haze of fury behind his eyes. His breath came short, chest rising and falling beneath his coat like a pressure valve ready to burst. His hand inched closer to his side, where beneath his jacket a small revolver waited, heavy and unfamiliar. Ezekiel had warned him, more than once, not to carry it. But something inside Daniel had told him to prepare, and now, here they were. The two enforcers behind Rafe chuckled, flanking their leader like vultures waiting to pick the bones clean. One of them, tall, wiry, with a long scar across his chin, tossed a glance at Daniel. "Kid looks like he's about to cry," he said with a crooked grin. "Maybe he needs his daddy to fight his battles." Ezekiel wiped the blood from his temple with the back of his sleeve, never taking his eyes off Rafe. "You've made your point," he said quietly, the steadiness of his voice betraying none of the pain behind it. "Now walk away." "This doesn't need to get worse," but Rafe only laughed. "Worse? Old man, it's just getting started." He took a slow step forward, gun still in hand but lowered now. Casual, confident, taunting. "You think this shop means something? A couple busted tires and rusted parts? You think that gives you claim to this street?" His eyes flicked to Daniel. "You brought your boy out here like this was some sort of lesson." "Maybe it is. Maybe it's time he learned what happens when ghosts of war pretend they still matter." Daniel's fingers brushed the grip of the revolver, hidden beneath the folds of his coat. His heart pounded in his ears, loud and unrelenting. He remembered the way his father had looked earlier that night, calm, proud, full of quiet wisdom. And now that same man stood bleeding, mocked by a gang leader in front of his own son. Rafe moved closer, just inches away now, invading Ezekiel's space like a man with nothing to fear. You want to protect this place, hero? Then protect it. Go on. Stop me. Ezekiel didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Rafe, but there was a subtle shift, just a flick of his gaze toward Daniel. Not a command, not even a plea, just a warning, a reminder. Daniel saw it, and still his hand didn't move away. Then Rafe leaned in, close enough for Ezekiel to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. You know what your real mistake was? He whispered, thinking anyone still gives a damn who you used to be. With a final insult, Rafe lifted the pistol again, slower this time, deliberate. The threat wasn't just to hurt, it was to humiliate, to prove dominance, to shatter legacy. Daniel stepped forward. Stop. His voice rang sharp through the air, clearer than he expected. Rafe turned, amused. Oh, you do speak, he said, grinning. What's the matter, kid? Can't watch your old man fall again? Daniel's hand was already halfway inside his coat, fingers curled tight around the grip of the revolver. Don't touch him again, he said, voice lower now, trembling but firm. The two enforcers straightened, shifting uneasily. Rafe didn't blink. Or what? The silence that followed was taut with electricity. Daniel didn't answer. His father's blood on the pavement answered for him. Then Rafe laughed again, short and sharp. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't. He never finished the sentence. The click of Daniel's revolver unsnapping from its holster was nearly lost in the chaos of the moment, but it silenced Rafe instantly. The gang leader's smirk faded just slightly, eyes narrowing as he looked down at the hand now emerging from Daniel's coat, gripping steel and resolve. Passers-by across the street stopped, watching from the shadows. No one dared step in. No one ever did when the vultures showed their wings. But this time, something had shifted. The balance of fear cracked. Rafe raised his hand again, this time not in a threat, but almost in surprise, as if realizing too late that Daniel wasn't bluffing. Ezekiel turned, eyes widening as he saw the weapon fully drawn. Daniel. But it was already too late. Daniel didn't fire. Not yet. His arms stayed steady, the gun aimed not wildly, but with purpose. Every inch of his body screamed to act, to protect, to make Rafe pay. But a single voice, his father's voice, echoed through his head. Not like this. Rafe, sensing hesitation, stepped closer, daring him. You gonna shoot me, boy? In front of your daddy? Is that what you think makes you a man? Daniel's finger curled tighter on the trigger, breathing ragged. Ezekiel stepped between them, blood trailing down his face but his expression unreadable. Daniel, he said, eyes fixed on his son. You do not start a war you're not ready to finish. Daniel's eyes burned, jaw locked. He didn't lower the gun. Not yet. But something in him paused. Rafe chuckled darkly, nodding slowly. That's what I thought. He turned away slightly, smug once again, lowering his weapon as if it no longer mattered. And that's when Ezekiel saw it. A flicker in Rafe's shoulder, a twitch in his grip, the subtle repositioning of a man preparing to strike again. A trap. Ezekiel opened his mouth to shout, but Daniel had already seen it too. The revolver rose. A single shot split the air. Rafe's jaw exploded in a burst of bone and blood. He crumpled instantly, clutching his face, gargling a scream through shattered teeth. His pistol clattered uselessly onto the sidewalk. The enforcers yelled in shock, stumbling back, hands flying to their weapons. Chaos erupted like a lit fuse. Daniel blinked, heart racing, the smoke of the shot still hovering near the muzzle of his gun. He didn't remember pulling the trigger, only the silence that followed, just before everything shattered. Ezekiel grabbed him, dragging him toward cover as the vultures pulled their guns. Shouts rang out, steel met concrete, and bystanders fled in every direction. Daniel stumbled, breathing hard, revolver still in hand. His father's grip was iron, guiding him behind a parked car as bullets began to fly. The quiet night was gone. In its place, war. One act of cruelty had lit the fire of vengeance. Rafe Calder's sneer hadn't even faded when the sharp crack of a gunshot split the night. The gang leader jerked violently, his body twisting as a single bullet tore through his jaw, splintering bone and teeth in a spray of blood. The smirk that had once mocked Ezekiel Grant now twisted into a grotesque mask of agony. Rafe dropped to his knees, both hands clutching the gory wreckage of his face. His scream came out as a strangled gurgle, wet and raw, swallowed by the thick, stunned silence that followed. Daniel Grant stood frozen, his revolver still raised, barrel smoking. His chest heaved, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the world. His finger trembled on the trigger. He had acted on instinct, not thought, driven by something primal and protective. It took him a second to realize what he had done, and what he had just started. Then the chaos erupted. Rafe's men, 3 of them nearby, snapped out of their shock and immediately reached for their weapons. "Get down!" Ezekiel barked, the sharp command slicing through Daniel's haze. The veteran, blood streaking down his temple from the earlier blow, lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing his son by the collar and pulling him toward the cover of a rusted-out sedan parked near the curb. Gunfire exploded behind them. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in sudden bursts like jagged lightning. Bullets clanged against metal, punched through windshield glass, and ricocheted off brick walls with sharp metallic whines. The peaceful quiet of the Kelmier night was gone, replaced by a storm of violence. Daniel stumbled beside his father, mind racing, heart thundering in his ears. His hands were slick with sweat, the revolver heavy now, not just with weight, but with consequence. He had never shot a man before, not in training, not in defense, never. But tonight he had aimed, fired, and watched a human face shatter beneath his bullet. There was no undoing it. "Stay low. Count your rounds," Ezekiel muttered, pressing his back to the car's frame. His voice was hoarse but steady, the tone of a man who had seen worse and lived. "Don't waste a shot. Aim center mass. You hear me?" Daniel nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. He swallowed hard, adrenaline flooding every inch of his body. His knuckles were white on the grip of the revolver. One of the vultures fired again, the shot striking the hood of the car with a deafening clang. Sparks jumped into the air, and Daniel flinched. "They're trying to flank us," Ezekiel said, peering over the edge of the fender for a split second before ducking back down. "One's moving left, tall guy with the shaved head. I want you to hold until you see his chest. Don't shoot unless you're sure." "Dad, Daniel started, but Ezekiel cut him off. "You did what you had to. Now you finish what you started." Daniel's jaw clenched. Somewhere behind them, a trash can toppled over as a bystander scrambled for safety. Shadows moved like phantoms in the alleys, faces watching from behind curtains. But none came forward. No one would challenge the vultures, not openly. Daniel braced himself. From the corner of the car, he saw the man his father had warned about, a lanky thug in a leather jacket and scuffed boots, holding a pistol with both hands. The man crept low, believing himself hidden by the shadows of a broken fence. Daniel waited. The second the man's torso shifted into the open, Daniel fired. The shot hit square in the chest. The man staggered backward, then dropped like a bag of bricks, his gun clattering on the sidewalk. Daniel exhaled shakily. The rush of fear mixed with something unfamiliar, resolve. "Good," Ezekiel said. He glanced at Daniel, nodding slightly, though his face was drawn with pain. Blood still oozed down the side of his head, but his eyes burned sharp and alert. "Keep breathing. We hold them here." The other 2 vultures weren't so bold now. One had taken cover behind a newspaper stand across the street. The other, shorter with a buzz cut and vest, was kneeling behind a pickup truck. They shouted to each other in broken curses and quick calls, trying to regroup, to figure out what had just happened to their leader and how 2 men, one old, one young, were now a threat. Daniel reloaded with shaking hands, slipping each round into the chamber with care. He dropped one, cursed under his breath, and fumbled to pick it up. Ezekiel steadied him with a hand to his forearm. "They're not used to resistance," Ezekiel said quietly. "They expected fear. You gave them fire. That changes things." But even as Ezekiel spoke, Daniel caught movement out of the corner of his eye, not from the shooters still outside, but from Rafe. The gang leader was still alive. His body convulsed, one arm dragging across the concrete. His gun was gone, but his fingers fumbled at his boot. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "He's moving," he hissed. Ezekiel followed his gaze and saw it. Rafe's bloodied hand pulled free a thin, curved blade from a hidden sheath in his boot. The broken man's eyes, swollen and filled with hate, locked onto Ezekiel's position. "No," Ezekiel whispered, then louder. "Daniel!" Rafe surged forward with a guttural growl, knife raised high. Ezekiel twisted, trying to raise his arm, but the wound on his head dulled his movement. Daniel turned just in time. He fired. The gunshot cracked like a thunderclap. The bullet tore into Rafe's upper arm just as the knife came down. The weapon spun from the gang leader's grasp, clattering uselessly across the pavement. Rafe collapsed again, body writhing, his jaw still a ruined mess. His breath came in rasps now, not words, but the hatred in his gaze burned hotter than ever. Daniel stood over him, breathing hard. For a moment, he didn't know if he should fire again. End it. But his father's voice grounded him. "Not yet," Ezekiel said, wiping blood from his brow with the back of his hand. "This fight's not over." All around them, gunfire still rang out, but now with a new rhythm. Not wild and dominant, but desperate. The gang had lost its advantage. Its leader was broken. Its hold on fear, fractured. Daniel dropped back beside his father, reloading again, his hands steadier now. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. He was no longer the same boy who had walked through those streets earlier that night. When blood stained the pavement, there was no turning back. Gunfire tore through the air as Daniel squeezed the trigger, his arms trembling but his aim disturbingly accurate. One of the bullets slammed into a thug's chest, dropping him instantly. The second enforcer, taller, heavier, barely had time to raise his weapon before Daniel's next shot found his throat. He stumbled backward, choking, and crashed onto the hood of a parked car with a metallic thud before sliding lifelessly to the ground. Smoke rose from the barrel of Daniel's revolver. He exhaled sharply, adrenaline flooding his body, his breaths shallow and ragged. He had never killed before. He had never even imagined it. Yet the weight of survival pressed harder than guilt. There was no time to think, only to move. "Right flank!" Ezekiel barked, his voice hoarse but commanding. Daniel whipped around just as two more vultures emerged from behind a lamppost, weapons raised. The older man's instincts kicked in like muscle memory from a forgotten battlefield. Ezekiel's eyes darted across their environment, the wrecked pickup truck, the broken crates on the curb, the shattered glass near the alley. Everything was a tool. Everything was a map. "Drop low." "Fire beneath the bumper," he ordered. Daniel obeyed, diving behind the crumpled remains of a garbage bin. He steadied his hand against the cold metal, aimed under the truck's undercarriage, and fired twice. The first bullet struck a kneecap with a sickening crack, sending the man screaming to the pavement. The second hit the other in the hip, twisting him violently mid-stride. From behind the wheel well, Ezekiel clenched his jaw, blood still streaming from the wound on his temple. He could feel his heartbeat pulsing in the injury. Pain throbbed behind his eyes, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when his son was fighting for both of them. "You all right?" Daniel called out, crawling beside his father. "I'm breathing," Ezekiel muttered, gripping his ribs as he sat back against a rusted dumpster. "Keep your head." "That's what wins wars." The younger man nodded, his face pale but resolute. He glanced toward the shop just 20 feet away, but the street between them might as well have been a mile. Every second, another shadow moved in the distance, drawn by the echo of violence. Then Ezekiel saw it. Headlights. He squinted through the smoke and dim streetlight, focusing on the growing glow in the far end of the street. A black SUV, headlights like twin daggers, rolled into view. Its engine growled low, the tires crunching over glass and shell casings. Behind it, two motorcycles flanked the vehicle like hungry wolves circling a kill. "More are coming," Ezekiel muttered. "This isn't just a warning anymore." This is a message Daniel followed his father's gaze and cursed under his breath. He had thought the worst was over when Rafe dropped, but that had just been the opening note. Now, the orchestra of violence played louder. Near the middle of the street, Rafe Calder writhed in agony. His jaw, half shattered by Daniel's bullet, hung at a grotesque angle. Blood poured from his face like oil, staining his shirt and the concrete beneath him. He couldn't speak, only grunt and groan, but his hand jerked upward, flailing toward his enforcers. His fingers curled in jagged, desperate signals demanding they keep firing. "He's still giving orders," Daniel whispered, stunned. Ezekiel's lip curled with disgust. Pride doesn't bleed out easily. The vultures responded to Rafe's gestures with renewed fury. They sprayed bullets in wide arcs, uncaring of aim, just wanting to reclaim their territory through noise and fear. Rafe's pain became their fuel. Daniel ducked as rounds struck a mailbox behind him, sending sparks flying. He covered his father with his body, shielding the older man with instinct more than thought. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and exhaust. "They're trying to trap us here," Daniel said. "They already did," Ezekiel replied, "but they made one mistake." "What's that?" "They think I'm broken." He sat up, grimacing as pain shot through his spine, and pointed toward the fire escape above the tailor's shop. "We move left, around the alley." But first, give me 2 bullets, then we teach them what it means to push men who've already lost everything." Daniel loaded the rounds into his revolver and helped his father to his feet. They moved with synchronized urgency, covering each other as they crawled along the wreckage. A bullet whizzed past, grazing Daniel's shoulder, but he kept going, refusing to fall. As they reached the alley's edge, Ezekiel paused to look back. Rafe, still on the ground, pounded a bloodied fist against the pavement in rage. His men surged forward at the command of a leader who could no longer speak, driven by loyalty or fear. Daniel helped his father lean against the brick wall, chest heaving from exhaustion. "We're not done yet," Ezekiel said, voice low. "I know," Daniel replied, his grip tightening on the pistol. Below them, the street continued to burn with chaos. The vultures screamed through the smoke. Gunfire flashed like lightning in a storm no one had asked for. The odds were impossible. But for the Grants, surrender was never an option. The quiet street had turned into a battlefield no soldier could ignore. The second wave of vultures stormed the street like a dark tide, rifles raised, bats clutched tightly in gloved fists, their angry shouts ricocheting off the brick walls of Kelmier's abandoned storefronts. The sound of boots pounding pavement grew louder, more aggressive, as if the night itself had chosen violence. Ezekiel Grant pressed his back against the wall of his shop, chest heaving with shallow, pained breaths. A streak of dried blood ran down his temple, clinging to the graying edge of his jaw. He blinked hard, forcing his vision to stay clear as the world threatened to tilt sideways. His left hand clenched the grip of a small pistol he'd picked off one of the fallen thugs. His right hand, his strong hand, hung limp, still trembling from the blow Rafe Calder had dealt earlier. "Daniel," he said, voice hoarse but grounded. "Stay low. Breathe. Pick your targets. Don't waste a shot. Just feet away." Daniel crouched behind a broken bumper, fingers fumbling with his revolver's cylinder. Each shell he loaded seemed to tremble in his grasp, not from fear, but from the weight of adrenaline flooding his veins. The revolver clicked shut. He exhaled sharply, then rose just high enough to peer over the hood. A shadow lunged. A gang member, broad-shouldered, wild-eyed, charged with a rusted crowbar raised above his head. The streetlight caught the edge of the weapon, flashing like lightning before a storm. Daniel didn't flinch. He lifted the revolver with both hands and squeezed the trigger. The man collapsed mid-run, the crowbar clattering to the pavement, his momentum sending him face-first into the concrete with a thud that echoed louder than the shot. Ezekiel didn't look. He didn't need to. The crack of his son's shot told him everything. More shadows followed, 6, maybe 7, racing from the alleyways like wolves in pursuit of prey. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets sprayed indiscriminately. Glass exploded from a nearby windshield. A neon sign shattered in a burst of sparks. The shop's front window, once proudly displaying tires and oil cans, shattered under the pressure of gunfire and chaos. Ezekiel dropped to a knee, winced, then steadied his aim. He fired twice. One shot took out a man's leg, the other struck another square in the shoulder. Both crumpled with cries of pain, their weapons falling uselessly beside them. But it wasn't enough. For every man who fell, 2 more seemed to come charging. Daniel pivoted to cover his father, firing again, the recoil rattling his wrist, but his eyes stayed locked, focused. The training he never had was replaced by instinct, sharpened by desperation. And still, the lesson burned in the back of his mind. This wasn't supposed to be his war. He ducked as bullets struck the metal near his head, sending sparks into his face. Breathing heavily, he turned to Ezekiel. "You okay?" he shouted. Ezekiel nodded, wiping blood from his brow. "I've seen worse," he said with a strained smile. "But not much." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Ezekiel, who had spent a lifetime shielding his son from the horrors of violence, now relied on Daniel to shield him. And Daniel, who had once promised never to pick up a gun unless he had no choice, now found himself firing round after round into the night, not for glory or vengeance, but to keep his father breathing. One of the vultures, a wiry man with a bandana wrapped over his nose, climbed onto the hood of a nearby sedan, aiming a shotgun down toward the Grants. Daniel saw him, swung up, and fired before the thug could get off a shot. The force of the impact sent the man tumbling backwards, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening crunch. More blood spilled. It ran along the cracks in the pavement, mixing with rainwater and oil. The street, once familiar, now resembled something from a war zone. Smoke curled from burning trash bins. Sirens were still absent, lost somewhere in the city's sleeping indifference. A deep voice rang out from the back of the mob, another vulture commanding the charge. "Push up! They're cornered! Bleed them out!" Daniel reloaded again, his hand steadier this time. The hesitation from earlier was gone. In its place was resolve, shaped by every scream and muzzle flash. "They won't break us," he muttered, half to himself, half to the storm around him. Ezekiel shifted beside a downed motorcycle, using the frame as cover. His breath was raspy now, but his eyes remained sharp. "Daniel," he called, eyes locked forward. "Two coming from your right. Stay low." Daniel obeyed without question, crouching as bullets tore through the space he'd just occupied. He rolled behind a tool cart, fired twice, one missed, the other struck a thug in the hip, sending him spinning to the ground. The other kept coming. A young enforcer, barely older than Daniel, ran forward, swinging a bat. Daniel rose, ducked the first swing, and slammed his shoulder into the thug's chest, sending them both stumbling. The bat clattered away. Daniel wrestled for control, fists flying. The thug reached for a knife, but Daniel grabbed a wrench from the cart and swung it upward with everything he had. The thug collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the ground. Daniel stood over him, breathing hard, face streaked with sweat and dust. His eyes met Ezekiel's. "You're learning fast," Ezekiel said, voice low but proud. Daniel gave a grim nod. "Didn't plan to." More shouts filled the air. The gang wasn't backing down. More were climbing over fences now, circling from both sides. The realization hit Ezekiel like a silent thunderclap. This isn't a retaliation. It's a purge. He looked toward his shop. Its door hung ajar, the window blown out. But inside were more weapons, more tools, and a structure they could use. A plan began to form in his battered mind. "We can't hold this spot," he said urgently. "We need better cover." Daniel followed his gaze. "The shop?" Ezekiel nodded. "We fall back. Set traps. Force them to come in after us." Daniel didn't hesitate. He ducked, grabbed a fallen pistol from the dirt, and offered his arm to help his father stand. Ezekiel gritted his teeth as he rose, every muscle in his body protesting. Together, they moved toward the shop, side by side, dodging fire as they slipped through the shattered entrance. Behind them, the vultures regrouped, gathering at the mouth of the street like jackals scenting weakness. The Grants disappeared into the shadows of their old repair shop, the lights inside flickering, tools rattling in drawers, machines humming faintly with leftover charge. Outside, the vultures advanced, unaware of the preparations waiting behind those battered walls. The fight had only just begun, and the night promised no mercy. Daniel's revolver clicked empty. The sharp metallic sound cut through the storm of gunfire like a cruel bell, signaling vulnerability. For a split second, he froze. His chest heaved, eyes wide, fingers numb from the relentless recoil. Around him, the air reeked of cordite, oil, and blood. Shouts roared from both ends of the street as the iron vultures tightened their noose. Boots pounded the pavement. Shadows closed in. Without thinking, Daniel dropped the useless revolver and dove toward the nearest body. A vulture enforcer crumpled face first in the gutter, blood still seeping from a wound in his neck. Daniel's hands trembled as he pried a blood-slicked pistol from the corpse's rigid grip. The handle was warm, sticky, but it fit into his hand like a challenge he hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. From behind the wrecked car, Ezekiel's voice broke through the chaos. "Don't lose your head. Control the storm." The words weren't barked like a command from the battlefield. They were strained, worn by pain, but laced with the gravity of a father who had walked through fire. Daniel turned slightly, catching a glimpse of his father's face, blood down his temple, eyes sharp despite the pallor. Ezekiel wasn't just telling him to survive, he was telling him to lead. Daniel nodded once, then rose into a crouch and fired. The pistol cracked in his hand, kicking back hard. A vulture sprinting from the left alley took the bullet square in the chest, falling backward into a pile of trash cans. The sound drew attention. Shouts rose, gunfire shifted. Bullets pinged off car hoods and shattered storefront windows. Sparks danced across metal as the air filled with the vicious rhythm of battle. Still low, Daniel pivoted, firing again. Another figure fell near the curb. But the pressure was mounting. From opposite ends of the street, more gang members advanced, some firing, others shouting threats, a few emboldened enough to charge with knives and bats. It was no longer just a shootout. It was a hunt, and Daniel was the prey trying to become the storm. He ducked behind the charred hood of a pickup, panting, ears ringing. "They're flanking," he muttered, more to himself than to his father. But Ezekiel was already watching. The older man leaned against a wall, gripping a jagged piece of metal in one hand, blood still seeping from his temple. His breaths were labored, but his mind was as clear as ever. "Shift left," Ezekiel said, pointing toward the back of the auto shop. "Don't get boxed in." Daniel started to nod when a flicker of movement caught Ezekiel's eye, something slithering along the ground behind the scattered debris. It wasn't another thug. It was something more sinister, more deliberate. "Daniel!" Ezekiel's voice cracked with urgency. Daniel spun in the direction of his father's gaze, his pulse skipping a beat. There, beneath the broken frame of a door, Rafe Calder was crawling through blood and shards of glass. His jaw was mangled, a mess of twisted bone and torn flesh, but his eyes were alive with venom. In his right hand, fingers slick with crimson, he reached toward the cuff of his boot, where a small, wicked-looking blade was sheathed. His body was a ruined shell, but his hatred was whole. Daniel raised the pistol, heart thundering in his chest, but Rafe moved faster than expected. With a groan, born of fury and defiance, the gang leader lunged forward, drawing the blade and launching himself toward Ezekiel with a snarl that came out as a bloody gurgle. Time bent. Daniel didn't think, he reacted. He pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The shot slammed into Rafe's forearm, the impact jolting the knife free from his hand. The blade spun end over end through the air before clattering across the sidewalk. Rafe howled, not from pain, but rage. His entire body seized, and he crumpled against the wall with his hand clutched to his ruined arm. Daniel stood over him, chest rising and falling in heaves. For a second, the world shrank to the broken man at his feet. The gang's leader, the monster who had mocked his father, cracked his skull open and brought war to their doorstep. He was still breathing, barely, but the fury hadn't left his eyes. Behind Daniel, the shouts of the vultures continued. Gunfire returned like a second wave crashing in. There was no time to finish Rafe, no time to think. Ezekiel called out again, voice ragged but clear. "Daniel, move!" Daniel snapped out of it, stepping back from Rafe as another round of bullets peppered the pavement. Sparks lit up the ground near his feet. The fight wasn't over, and the man they thought they'd broken still refused to die. The wounded serpent still had venom left to strike. Bullets cracked through the air like lightning ripping open the night. Shards of brick and glass flew in every direction as the firefight raged on, turning the quiet street into a war zone of smoke, blood, and chaos. Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs, his breath shallow and quick, each inhale scraping like sandpaper through his throat. The kick of the pistol in his hand had become familiar, almost rhythmic, but nothing about this felt normal. His arms trembled from exhaustion, and the weight of fear clung to his skin like cold sweat. He ducked behind a rusted sedan, its frame riddled with holes, just as a hail of gunfire swept past. The heat from the bullets sizzled through the air above his head. "3, on your left," Ezekiel rasped from his position across the street, crouched low against the wall of the shop. His voice was cracked but clear, laced with the focus of a soldier who had seen too many battles. Blood matted the side of his head, and his shirt clung to his side where a wound bled freely, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating every angle, every shadow, every exposed flank. Daniel didn't respond with words. He trusted the signal. On his father's cue, he burst from cover in a low roll, coming up into a firing stance just as 3 vultures turned their guns toward him. He squeezed the trigger 3 times, each shot clean, fast, devastating. The gang members fell before their fingers could find their triggers. Daniel dropped back behind the car, gasping, the weight of what he'd done pressing on him even as his mind screamed for focus. This wasn't over. Not yet. Across the battlefield, Ezekiel pressed a bloodied palm against the wall to steady himself. His legs threatened to buckle, but he gritted his teeth. He couldn't fall. Not now. Not while his son still fought with every ounce of will he had. "You're doing good," he murmured to himself. "More prayer than praise. Hold the line." The gunfire lessened for a moment, giving way to the eerie silence between battles, the breath before the next storm. Daniel used the pause to reload, hands slick with sweat and dirt. His mind flashed with the memory of his father's voice earlier that day, warning him not to bring the revolver. That same revolver now sat hot in his holster, empty but sacred. Then came the sound that twisted everything. Sirens, faint but growing. A wailing chorus clawing through the edge of the night. Hope? Maybe. But Ezekiel's instincts spoke louder than hope. "They're not stopping," he muttered. "They want this done before the cavalry arrives." He was right. The vultures surged again, screaming curses and vengeance like a wave refusing to break. They had ruled these streets with fear, and now, backed into a corner, their pride demanded victory. Rafe Calder, barely standing, his jaw an unrecognizable mess of blood and broken bone, stood behind them, clutching his ribs and growling unintelligible orders. His eyes, wild and hateful, scanned for Daniel, blaming the boy for every crack in his empire. Daniel shifted position behind the wrecked car, peeking over the hood. He caught sight of one gang member trying to flank left. "One coming around, Blue Jacket," he shouted. Ezekiel nodded, already lifting his borrowed rifle. A shot rang out and the flanker dropped, but the movement triggered more aggression. Another wave came crashing, forcing Daniel to duck as bullets peppered the car. His thoughts swirled, fatigue weighing heavier with each breath. How many more? How long can we keep this up? Still, he didn't quit. "Focus on the corners," Ezekiel called out, voice strained but steady. "They're trying to pin us," Daniel responded by shifting his position slightly, using a trash bin for cover and creating a crossfire pattern with his father. It worked. Two of the vultures hesitated, unsure which direction was safe. One tried to dart forward, but Daniel dropped him with a quick shot. Another froze completely, and Ezekiel put him down. The fight pressed on. Fires from the earlier explosions crackled along the edges of the sidewalk, lighting the battlefield with a flickering orange glow. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, making it impossible to tell how many enemies still moved in the dark. The sirens grew louder, but still no flashing lights arrived. Rafe, leaning against a busted light pole, raised his good arm and pointed forward, hissing a command that only his most loyal could understand. Two more men broke cover, trying to rush the Grants from the side. Ezekiel turned, but too slow. He staggered, dizzy, and dropped to a knee. "Dad!" Daniel yelled, popping up and firing wildly to stop the rush. He hit one. The second fired back, grazing Daniel's leg. Pain lanced up through him, but he stayed on his feet. Limping, he closed the gap and fired again, stopping the threat. He reached Ezekiel, grabbing him under the arm and dragging him toward better cover. "We're not finished," Ezekiel whispered. "Not yet." Daniel pressed a trembling hand against his father's bleeding side. "We will be. Just hold on." The sound of boots slapping pavement caught Daniel's ear. He spun around only to see more figures flooding into the alley, a dozen more, armed and ruthless. The gang wasn't broken yet, and at the back of them all stood Rafe, jaw hanging, spitting blood onto the ground. His hand rose again, motioning for more. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He squared his shoulders and prepared for the next round. The hunter had become prey, but the prey was not yet safe. But one trigger pulled in defense can change everything in a heartbeat. The son who grew up learning the rules of war was done watching in silence. If you stand for family and justice, hit subscribe. The shot came fast, cutting through the night like lightning. Joran's bullet hissed past Daniel's ear and struck Ezekiel across the shoulder. The veteran staggered back with a grunt, his body jerking against the iron door of the shop. For a brief moment his legs gave way, and he dropped to one knee. Blood spread quickly across his shirt, darkening the fabric. Daniel's voice cracked in panic. "Father!" He lunged forward, catching Ezekiel beneath the arms and dragging him toward the shop's door. His muscles strained, his mind reeling with fear, but he pulled his father inside and kicked the door shut with all his strength. The sound of the lock snapping into place was drowned by the furious pounding of fists and boots outside. Shadows flickered against the frosted glass as the iron vultures battered the entrance, their voices rising in a storm of curses and threats. Daniel's chest heaved, his breath ragged, while his father slumped against the wall. Ezekiel's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched tight against the pain. His eyes, though, still held their fire, the same fire that had once carried him across battlefields. "Barricade the door," Ezekiel rasped, his voice firm despite the blood that trickled down his arm. "Don't waste time." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but he obeyed without hesitation. The shop around them smelled of oil and rust, tools scattered across benches, half-built machines lying in silence like dormant beasts. His hands trembled as he shoved a heavy toolbox against the door, then grabbed a crate of spare gears and pushed it into place. The pounding outside grew louder, wood creaking as though it might split at any moment. "They're going to break through," Daniel muttered under his breath, fear flashing in his eyes. "Then make them regret it," Ezekiel replied, pushing himself upright against the wall. He gripped his shoulder with one hand, blood slipping between his fingers, but he refused to let weakness show. His gaze swept the room with the soldier's eye, already turning the clutter into weapons. Daniel swallowed hard, his desperation driving him into motion. He grabbed a sack of nails from a corner and scattered them across the floor near the entrance, his hands moving fast, his mind racing with visions of enemies slipping, falling, bleeding. Then he dragged an old car battery onto the workbench, wires dangling like veins. His fingers fumbled with the copper, twisting it tight against the metal doorframe. Sparks crackled when he touched the contacts, the faint blue glow of electricity flashing in the dim light. It was crude, but it would sting anyone reckless enough to grab the handle. Outside, the gang roared louder, their boots thudding like drums of war. Joran's voice rose above the others, sharp and mocking. "We'll tear you apart. You can't hide in there forever." The words stabbed through the air, but Daniel ignored them, sweat streaking his face as he tightened the last wire. His father's breathing had grown heavier, but Ezekiel still gripped a wrench in his good hand, his knuckles white, his body poised like a wolf waiting to strike. Daniel crouched beside him, his chest heaving. "They won't stop, Father. They'll keep coming until—" He couldn't finish the thought, his voice choking on the weight of it. Ezekiel fixed him with a fierce stare, his voice steady despite the weakness creeping into his limbs. "Then we make this place our ground. We hold it, or we die trying. Fear is their weapon. Don't hand it to them." Daniel nodded, though his throat was tight. His mind felt split in two, part of him screaming to flee, the other whispering that his father was right. The clang of metal outside shook him back to the present. The door rattled violently, sparks flying where the wires kissed steel. A cry of pain rang out, one of the vultures foolish enough to grab the handle. It bought them a few seconds, but no more. The pounding returned, heavier, angrier. Daniel's hands tightened on the pistol he had taken earlier. His arms ached from the weight of battle, but he refused to lower it. He glanced at his father, who straightened despite the blood soaking his shirt. Ezekiel's expression was grim but unyielding, his shadow long and defiant against the flickering shop lights. Then came a sound that froze them both. Rafe's broken voice, muffled by his ruined jaw yet laced with venom. "Grant, I'll tear your shop down brick by brick, you hear me? Brick by brick." His vow slithered through the cracks of the door, a promise of destruction that felt heavier than the blows themselves. Daniel's stomach twisted, his fear sharpening into rage. He pressed his back against the barricade, the gun steady in his hands, nails glinting on the floor, sparks still humming on the metal. He had done all he could. Now it was only a matter of time. The pounding grew louder, rattling through the walls. Every thud shook dust from the rafters, every shout clawed at their nerves. Yet in that moment, father and son stood together, one bleeding but unbroken, the other trembling but fierce. The shop around them seemed to hold its breath, tools gleaming like silent witnesses, machines waiting in stillness. And then came the truth Daniel could no longer deny. This was no longer just their shop. It had become something else entirely, a place where survival would be forged or shattered, a place where the night itself would decide whether they lived or died. The shop that once built machines was now a fortress of war. The barricade shook violently as the iron vultures slammed against it, the heavy thud of boots and shoulders rattling through the shop's frame. Sparks leapt into the dim room when one of the gang members grabbed the electrified handle, his scream slicing through the chaos outside. For a brief moment the assault faltered, cries of pain and confusion breaking the rhythm of their attack. But hesitation did not last. The gang pushed harder, fury overcoming fear, the sound of fists, boots, and weapons hammering against wood and steel filling the air with a dreadful rhythm. Inside, Daniel's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, his breathing sharp as he aimed his revolver toward the shattered window. His traps had worked. They had slowed the onslaught, but only for seconds. He knew now that seconds were all they would ever buy. He gritted his teeth, sweat dripping into his eyes as he sighted the next man forcing his way through the window. The gun barked in his hand, the flash briefly illuminating his strained face, and the intruder fell backward into the night. Ezekiel coughed heavily, his blood staining the collar of his shirt as he leaned against the workbench. He reached for a heavy wrench with trembling fingers, his knuckles white as he closed around it like it was the only weapon left between life and death. His eyes, though dulled by pain, still carried the fire of a soldier who refused to surrender. "Resolve, Daniel," he rasped, his voice carrying both command and plea. "Survival isn't just bullets. It's the will to stand when everything pushes you down." Daniel didn't answer at once, his focus locked on the figures crawling through broken glass. He shot one, then another, his accuracy sharpened by desperation. The recoil jolted his arm, but he refused to lower the weapon. Inside his chest, fear still burned, but it was tempered now by something stronger: responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy who once flinched at the idea of violence now stood like a soldier, protecting the very man who had always been his shield. The barricade splintered with a deafening crack as more of the vultures rammed the door. Wood chips flew across the room, and a metal hinge screamed under the pressure. Ezekiel pushed himself forward despite the pain, raising the wrench high. The first intruder who managed to squeeze past the door met the swing head-on, collapsing with a groan as steel met bone. The veteran staggered but stayed upright, gripping the wrench like a lifeline. His breath came harsh and shallow, but his stance spoke of determination unbroken by age or wounds. Daniel's shots rang out again, echoing in the confined space. A man lunging through the window dropped before his boots hit the ground. Another tried to climb over the barricade but was met with a bullet between his shoulders. The shop smelled of gunpowder, oil, and blood, the familiar scent of machines now mixed with the stench of death. Daniel's hands trembled, but his eyes were steady, every pull of the trigger born of necessity. "Keep them out," Ezekiel growled, shoving another attacker back with the wrench. His voice was hoarse, filled with grit and strain. "I'm trying," Daniel shouted back, his own voice carrying the edge of both panic and defiance. He fired again, his body jerking with the force of each shot, his ears ringing from the constant explosions. The small shop had become a storm of noise, light, and violence. The gang's numbers pressed them harder, each wave more relentless than the last. Glass crunched under boots, blood slicked the floor, and the cramped room turned into a battlefield where every second was a fight for survival. Ezekiel's arms trembled from the weight of the wrench, his muscles burning, yet each swing carried enough force to send men sprawling. Daniel's heart thundered as his gaze caught the movement outside the window. Across the street, more headlights cut through the night, the beams casting long shadows that stretched toward the shop like grasping hands. His stomach clenched as the realization sank in. These weren't just stragglers. Reinforcements were coming, perhaps the entire gang, maybe more than they could ever hope to fight. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, the revolver's cylinder warm against his palm as he reloaded with shaking fingers. The noise of approaching engines blended with the cries of the men outside, the chaos merging into a single, terrifying truth. They were far from finished. Ezekiel, panting, wiped the blood from his brow with the back of his hand. His voice was quieter now, but no less firm as he muttered, "They're not done yet. We have to be ready." Daniel's jaw tightened as he looked back at his father, seeing not only the injuries but also the stubborn fire in his eyes. He turned again toward the window, his resolve hardening, his grip steadying. The barricade shook once more, glass shattered under boots, and Daniel fired into the night, determined to fight until there was nothing left to give. And yet, as the fresh wave of vultures poured forward and the new lights approached, one truth cut colder than the night air. This was no longer a battle for survival. It was war. The night's true storm had only just begun. The shop walls rattled violently as the gang's trucks screeched to a halt outside, their engines growling like beasts ready to devour. Headlights cut through the shattered windows, flooding the interior with harsh beams that danced across broken glass and blood-smeared concrete. Daniel's breath hitched, his grip tightening on the revolver slick with sweat and grime. The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of boots as dozens of vultures spilled into the street, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the flickering flames that licked at the shop walls. Each shadow seemed larger than life, a reminder of the overwhelming numbers pressing against them. Ezekiel leaned heavily against the counter, pale and bleeding, yet his voice carried the steadiness of command. He placed a bloodied hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze sharp despite the haze of pain clouding his eyes. "Make every shot count," he whispered, his tone firm, almost fatherly and soldierly at once. Daniel turned to him briefly, their eyes locking. In that moment, the bond between them solidified, no longer just father and son, but comrades bound by necessity, by blood, and by survival. The barricades shook under the relentless push of the gang. Wooden beams cracked, glass shattered further, and the metallic groan of bending hinges filled the air as the vultures forced their way inside with sheer brute strength. Daniel lifted his revolver, his jaw set. He fired again and again, each shot tearing through the smoke, each bullet carving a desperate line between life and death. His body jolted with every recoil, the sound ringing in his ears until it seemed louder than his own heartbeat. Ezekiel, despite his failing strength, bent to retrieve a dropped pistol from the floor. His hands shook, but his eyes remained unflinching as he took position beside his son, firing with the calm precision of a man who had lived a lifetime in war. The air thickened with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Every breath burned in Daniel's lungs, every blink stung with the sharp bite of smoke. Shouts of the vultures echoed like war cries, curses thrown with every push forward. The shop floor became a storm of chaos, bullets sparking against walls, debris raining from the ceiling, blood pooling where men had fallen. Daniel's chest heaved as he reloaded, hands fumbling with trembling urgency. His mind screamed at him to hold on, to not falter, because any hesitation meant death. Then came the sudden, horrifying twist. A bottle arced through the air, its glass glinting orange in the firelight before it shattered against the wall. In an instant, flames roared to life, devouring wood and crawling hungrily across the walls. Heat surged, blistering and suffocating, pressing against their skin like a living enemy. The fire crackled with a sound as terrifying as the gunfire outside, threatening to swallow the shop that had become their only fortress. "Father!" Daniel cried, choking on smoke as he aimed toward the spreading blaze. But Ezekiel's voice cut through, harsh and commanding. "No time! We move, now!" His face was grim, eyes narrowed against both pain and flame. The old soldier understood what Daniel was still realizing. Fire was merciless, and if they stayed, it would consume them faster than the bullets. Daniel's throat tightened, but he nodded, forcing himself to act. Together they pushed toward the side exit, Ezekiel dragging himself with sheer willpower, Daniel covering him with a storm of bullets. The barricades behind them crumbled under the gang's renewed charge, shadows and gunfire spilling into the inferno they were leaving behind. The fire roared louder, swallowing the shop that had once been their life's work, now reduced to ash and smoke. The alley burst into view as Ezekiel shoved open the side door. Cool night air rushed in, clashing against the heat they had fled. Yet freedom offered no safety. Gunfire exploded around them like lightning, every flash revealing the distorted faces of the vultures waiting in ambush. Daniel's pulse thundered, but his aim stayed true, each shot pushing them forward step by step. Beside him, Ezekiel stumbled, his face contorted with pain, yet he raised his weapon, firing with unbroken resolve. And then Daniel saw him. Through the haze of smoke and chaos, staggering in the open like a phantom refusing to die, stood Rafe Calder. His jaw was a grotesque ruin, blood dripping down his shirt, but his eyes burned with hatred so fierce it seemed to defy death itself. His body swayed, broken and beaten, yet his presence alone made the other vultures rally. Daniel's breath caught, his knuckles whitening on the pistol. For an instant, time seemed to slow. Daniel could hear only his father's ragged breathing, the pounding of his own heart, and the guttural rasp of Rafe's struggle for breath. It was as if the entire night had led to this moment, where survival hinged on one last confrontation. Foreshadowing lingered like a storm cloud, Rafe was not finished, and his presence was a promise of more violence yet to come. Ezekiel pulled Daniel behind a stack of crates, coughing through blood but still commanding. "Eyes open, son," he whispered, voice hoarse but steady. "The serpent still lives." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight, eyes locked on Rafe's staggering figure in the alley. And in that instant, the reality settled over him like ice. No matter the blood spilled, no matter the fire consuming everything behind them, the battle would not end until Rafe Calder was gone for good. For now, though, the enemy still stood, his shadow stretching long across the alley. The serpent still writhed, refusing to die. The shotgun rose, its black barrel glinting faintly under the dim alley lights, and for a frozen heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that single motion. Rafe Calder, half dead but unwilling to surrender, lifted the weapon with trembling arms. His jaw hung in ruin, his breaths came in ragged wheezes, yet his eyes burned with a hatred that refused to fade. The sight froze Ezekiel Grant in place. He knew that if the trigger pulled, there would be no chance to dodge. His body ached, his strength nearly gone, but instinct screamed that death had come knocking. Daniel, only a few feet away, turned just in time to see the weapon aimed squarely at his father. "No!" Daniel's voice tore from his throat, hoarse with exhaustion and fear. His heart hammered as he raised his pistol, but in that instant, he knew he was too late. The shotgun was already locked, Rafe's finger tightening on the trigger. Panic and rage warred inside Daniel. His father's life hung by a thread, and he could not cut it fast enough. He lunged forward, desperate to close the distance, but even in that brief second, his mind screamed that the movement was hopeless. Then chaos shifted. A vulture, one of the panicked gang members firing wildly into the melee, let loose a bullet meant for the Grants. The shot cracked like thunder in the narrow alley, echoing off the crumbling brick walls, but fate twisted its path. The bullet buried itself in Rafe's chest. His body jerked violently as the force knocked him backward. The shotgun slipped from his blood-slick hands, clattering loudly against the pavement. Rafe staggered, his breath leaving him in a strangled rasp. His eyes widened in disbelief, as though the betrayal of chance was too much for even his hatred to endure. His legs gave way, and he dropped to his knees. Blood spilled down his chest in a thick stream, soaking the tattered remains of his coat. He tried to speak, perhaps a curse, perhaps a final command, but his shattered jaw turned his words into guttural gasps. His once fearsome presence was reduced to a broken shadow. For a moment, the alley fell into eerie silence. The vultures froze, watching their leader crumble. Some stared in horror, others in stunned disbelief. The very man they had followed without question now knelt in his own ruin, not felled by enemy fire but by the recklessness of his own side. It was as though the night itself had judged him, and the sentence had been carried out without mercy. Ezekiel exhaled, his chest tight as if he had been holding his breath for hours. He lowered the wrench he had been ready to swing, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of what had nearly been. Daniel, still gripping his pistol, stepped forward cautiously, his heart still racing. His eyes locked on Rafe's staggering form, torn between finishing the fight and simply watching it end on its own. Rafe swayed, blood bubbling from his lips. His gaze, clouded yet fierce, fixed on Ezekiel. He raised one hand weakly, as if to curse him, as if to claw at the man he had wanted to destroy, but his strength was gone. His body collapsed sideways onto the cold ground, the final rattle of his breath fading into the night. The effect was instant. The vulture's formation dissolved. Some men dropped their weapons entirely, retreating with eyes wide in terror. Others bolted down the alley, fleeing into the shadows as though chased by the ghost of their fallen leader. The gunfire dwindled to nothing, leaving only the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant wail of sirens drawing closer. Daniel lowered his pistol slowly, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. He could scarcely believe what he had seen, that their greatest enemy, the man who had tormented them, had fallen not by his hand, but by the carelessness of his own soldiers. The irony of it pressed heavily on him, mingling relief with unease. Ezekiel stepped closer, his face pale but steady, his eyes meeting his son's in grim understanding. Neither spoke at first, for words felt too small to contain the moment. The battle that had seemed unwinnable had shifted in a heartbeat, not because of their power, but because chaos had turned inward on itself. Ezekiel placed a trembling hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice low and weary. "It's over. For now." Daniel nodded, but he knew in his heart that nothing was truly over. This night would haunt them, burned into their memories with the smell of blood and gunpowder. He looked once more at Rafe's still form, lying broken in the alley, and a chilling realization swept over him. Their survival had come not from strength alone, but from fate's cruel hand. And in that realization lay a truth he could not ignore. Fate was as dangerous an ally as it was a savior. Ezekiel's weary eyes met his son's, both realizing the war had shifted. The monster fell by the hand of his own shadow. The sirens cut through the night with a shrill cry, their red and blue lights washing across the ruined street like a tide of judgment. The air smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and iron, a harsh blend that clung to every breath. Daniel pressed his back against the cold brick, his revolver slipping from his trembling hand and clattering onto the blood-slick ground. His chest rose and fell in frantic bursts as the enormity of the night crashed upon him. Around him, bodies lay twisted in silence, the weapons of fallen vultures scattered like discarded promises of violence. For the first time since the chaos began, stillness returned, but it was not peace. It was aftermath. Ezekiel staggered forward, his face pale and streaked with blood, each step driven by sheer will rather than strength. He collapsed beside his son, gripping Daniel's shoulder with a hand heavy and trembling. His voice came low, broken by pain, yet firm with conviction. "You fought with honor, son," he whispered. The words carried the weight of pride, yet their truth cut deeper than any blade. For years, Ezekiel had tried to shield Daniel from this world, to keep him from the very violence that had shaped his own life. Tonight, the irony was cruel and undeniable. His son had not only embraced the fight, but had become the shield that saved them both. Daniel turned to his father, eyes wide, voice shaking. "I didn't want this, Father. I didn't want any of this." His words cracked under the weight of grief and disbelief, his hands still trembling as if the gunfire echoed inside his bones. Ezekiel pulled him closer, pressing their foreheads together for a brief moment, his breath ragged, his blood soaking into Daniel's shirt. "No man ever does," he said softly, "but when the storm comes, we stand, and you stood." The wail of sirens grew louder as police vehicles screeched to a halt at both ends of the street. Doors slammed, boots struck asphalt, and shouts rang through the night as officers swarmed into the chaos. Their flashlights cut through the smoke, beams dancing over shattered glass and fallen men. The first officer to reach the alley froze, his breath catching as he took in the sight. 2 men alive in the center of devastation, surrounded by the broken remnants of an army that had once ruled the streets. "Drop your weapons. Hands where I can see them," an officer barked, his rifle raised, his voice a mixture of command and disbelief. Daniel raised his empty hands slowly, the blood smeared across his fingers glistening under the light. His revolver already lay abandoned, but his gesture was one of surrender, of exhaustion. Ezekiel, barely able to lift his arms, leaned against his son, his eyes half-lidded but still burning with defiance. The officers advanced cautiously, stepping over bodies, their faces tightening as the truth became undeniable. One of them muttered under his breath, "What in the world happened here?" Another shook his head, whispering, "2 men against all this? It's impossible." Yet the evidence lay around them in crimson silence, undeniable and raw. Paramedics rushed forward, kneeling beside Ezekiel, their hands moving quickly as they checked his wounds. The veteran groaned but refused to release Daniel's arm until the medics forced his grip open. "Stay with him," Daniel pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, just don't let him go." The medics exchanged urgent glances, their faces grim as they lifted Ezekiel onto a stretcher. His head lolled back, but his lips still moved faintly, whispering words meant only for his son. Daniel leaned close and caught the faint echo. "You're stronger than you believe." Daniel staggered after them, desperate to stay by his father's side, but an officer blocked his path. "Hold on, son. We need to ask you some questions." The man's tone was calm but firm, his hand resting near his holster, not as a threat but as a reminder of authority. Daniel's voice shook with frustration. "My father needs me." "Can't this wait?" His plea fell heavy in the air, but the officer shook his head. "Your father's in good hands. We need to know what happened here. Now." The young man's shoulders slumped as he realized he had no choice. Around him, the night seemed to press in, every broken body a reminder of what his hands had done. His heart pounded as the questions began. Who fired first? How many were there? Why did it come to this? Daniel struggled to find words, his throat dry, his mind flashing with images of blood, fire, and the hollow eyes of the fallen, and then his gaze drifted back to the alley where it had all ended. There, crumpled in the shadow of the shop, lay Rafe Calder. The once feared leader of the Iron Vultures was a broken husk, his jaw a ruin, his chest pierced by the very bullet of his own man. His hand still clutched the shotgun he had meant to use to end Ezekiel, but death had stilled his vengeance. The sight was surreal, a man who had terrorized the city for years undone not by his enemies, but by the chaos he commanded. Daniel's breath caught in his chest, the bitter taste of irony settling on his tongue. The officers moved among the wreckage, collecting weapons, marking bodies, whispering in disbelief. Some glanced at Daniel with suspicion, others with awe, but none of their looks eased the weight pressing on him. For all their questions, none could ask the one that mattered most. What would this night make of him? As the paramedics carried Ezekiel toward the flashing lights, Daniel stood frozen in place, every step he wished to take toward his father blocked by duty, by law, by the reality of what had been unleashed. His hands still shook, the memory of the revolver's recoil echoing in his bones. He felt hollow, as if something vital had been carved out of him. The street, once ruled by fear, now lay broken and quiet, but Daniel knew peace had not been won. It had only been borrowed. The scars etched into his heart would not fade, nor would the memories of the faces that had fallen under his hand. He swallowed hard, his voice little more than a whisper as he spoke to himself, the words trembling in the cold night. Survival had been earned, but peace was still far away. Weeks later, Kelmere City began to change. The shadows that once clung to its streets seemed to loosen their grip, though the scars of violence lingered in the alleys and on the faces of those who had lived too long in fear. The fall of the Iron Vultures had not been quiet, it echoed like a thunderclap, shaking rival gangs and leaving the underworld fractured. Some groups dissolved overnight, while others slithered into hiding, unwilling to test their fate after witnessing the destruction of the Vultures. The air felt different now. Shopkeepers dared to keep their lights on later, and children, once confined indoors, slowly ventured back onto sidewalks with hesitant laughter. Yet beneath the small signs of hope, the city carried whispers, stories of two men who had stood against an army and lived. And with those whispers came unease, for survival carried its own weight. In a sterile hospital room, Ezekiel Grant sat propped up against crisp white pillows. His skin was pale, the lines of battle etched deeper into his face, but his eyes remained sharp. Neighbors came in shifts, bringing small gifts of fruit, flowers, or simply their gratitude. They spoke softly, almost reverently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm surrounding him. Ezekiel listened with quiet patience, nodding to each story of how the streets were safer, how families could walk without fear, how the iron grip of the Vultures had broken. He accepted their thanks but deflected their praise, always redirecting the conversation toward resilience, toward dignity. When the visitors left, silence would settle back over the room, broken only by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the occasional squeak of Daniel's chair as the young man sat vigil at his side. Daniel carried the heaviest burden. Though the city's tone had shifted, his nights were still lit with fire and blood. He worked at the auto shop during the day, hands stained with grease instead of gunpowder, but every clang of metal against metal carried him back to that night. At times, he would pause mid-repair, frozen, the faces of the fallen flashing before him. Some customers greeted him as a hero, clasping his shoulder with pride, while others avoided his eyes, whispering that he was no different from the men he had killed. The contradiction gnawed at him. He wanted peace, but peace refused to take root inside him. He found himself wandering the shop after hours, tools untouched, staring at the half-fixed motorcycle his father had once promised they'd rebuild together. One evening, as dusk bled across the city and painted the windows with fading orange light, a knock came at the shop door. Daniel hesitated, his chest tightening, until the sound repeated, softer this time, hesitant as if the knocker feared being heard. He opened the door a crack, prepared for trouble, but found a familiar face. A boy barely older than him, one of the Vultures who had fought that night. His clothes hung loose, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, but his hands were empty, palms raised in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want trouble," the boy said quickly, his voice trembling yet carrying a desperate edge. "I came because I can't go back to that life." His words hung heavy in the air, brittle with sincerity. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near the doorframe where a wrench lay within reach. "Then why come here?" he asked, his tone guarded, his gaze narrowing. The boy swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder before leaning closer. "Because you're the only one they'll listen to now. The others, what's left of them, they're trying to regroup. I know where they're hiding, what they're planning. I can help you stop them, if you'll let me." His eyes flickered with something Daniel recognized, the same mix of fear and longing he had felt himself not long ago. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He studied the boy's face, searching for deceit, for a hidden blade waiting to strike. But all he saw was exhaustion, a young man fraying at the edges of survival. The irony did not escape him. One of the very gang members who had once sought his death now sought his trust. The weight of decision pressed on Daniel's shoulders, heavier than any weapon he had carried. Inside his mind, echoes of his father's voice stirred. Ezekiel had taught him that survival was not built on vengeance, but on resolve, on dignity. This choice was more than a risk. It was a test. He could turn the boy away, condemn him to the streets, and perhaps allow the Vultures to rise again. Or he could listen, gamble on the possibility of redemption, and take the first step toward something larger than survival. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "If you're lying, if this is some kind of trick, I won't hesitate." He let the words hang like a blade in the air, sharp and final. The boy nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face, though fear still rooted his movements. As Daniel closed the door behind them and led the boy into the dim light of the shop, his heart pounded with a rhythm not of fear, but of change. He realized then that the night of fire had not just ended a battle, it had begun something new. The streets would never be the same, and neither would he. The boy who had entered that night had become a man forged in fire, and though his path would never be the same, his father's pride stood as a light guiding him forward. From blood and ruin, a new strength was born. In 1 second, the room flipped, the gang leader's jaw shattered, and chaos reigned. The fight wasn't about age or strength, it was about blood, loyalty, and justice. Subscribe now if you believe truth always hits harder than hate. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of intimidation, retaliation, and the unforeseen consequences of violence. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark reflection, and inspire accountability, empathy, and respect in the face of conflict and abuse of power.